Project Sunflower, Harmony, Chapter 9, Departures. Erin. The front door opened to allow a wobbly-legged Erin to stagger into her home. A nudge with a hind leg closed the door behind her as Erin made her way to the kitchen. With her legs all trembling, it was an easy decision for her to not bother with the glass, instead just turning on the faucet and sticking her head under the flow of water with her mouth open as she drank greedily. Once sated, Erin sat back and ran a foreleg across her wet mouth. That run had been much harder than she'd expected. Not only were her legs sore and her mane and tail a knotted mess, but the dried sweat in her coat was making the hair stick out in crazy spikes and swirls all over her body. She made her way into the bathroom, turning on the shower and letting the water heat up to lukewarm before hopping in. With a contented sigh, she just stood under the jet of water, letting it sluice over her, tickling the hair on her belly as it ran down towards her hoofs. 30 minutes later, and after some vigorous scrubbing, Erin stepped out while drying herself with a large white towel. The bottom of her bathtub was dotted with burrs and plant debris that she'd painstakingly pulled out of her coat and tail, minor trophies that she'd acquired during her run through the tall grass and wildflowers on the outskirts of Ponyville. Erin did her best to ignore her growling stomach as she started grooming herself. She started with her mane and worked along her coat before finally finishing up with her tail, pulling out a few more burrs that she'd missed along the way. When she was finished with the brushing, she opened up her Feathermaster kit in order to attend to her wings. It was a very different Erin who stepped out of the bathroom almost an hour after she had first gone in. Most of the exhaustion was gone and her hair was nicely brushed, though still damp. As she made her way to the kitchen in order to finally shut up her complaining stomach, a thought occurred to her. "Oh yeah, I was supposed to start bringing Twilight with me on my morning runs." She chuckled as she opened the cardboard box that held the rest of the bakery items from her welcome back party. Back in her old pony body, Twilight had been barely able to keep up with her even when Erin was going slowly. Now she had to wonder whether or not her unicorn friend would be leaving her in the dust. As she chewed on a raspberry-filled jelly donut, Erin decided that she could worry about that later. If nothing else, Twilight being in better shape than she was might actually convince the bookish unicorn to get out and exercise more often, which was a win-win as far as Erin was concerned. Erin considered her plans for the day as she washed down her less-than-healthy breakfast with still more water directly from the sink. More unpacking didn't seem all that appealing. And, as comfortable as her couch was, she wanted an actual, real bed. And maybe some foods that would be simpler for her to prepare wouldn't be a bad idea. "Shopping it is, then," Erin said as she walked back towards the front door. She slipped on her pipe green saddlebags with the sunflower clasps and went outside. She decided to leave the cart behind, opting to keep the grocery shopping to a minimum for now, at least until she got better at cooking. With her legs recovered from her morning run, Erin smiled and broke into an easy trot, heading towards the main market of Ponyville. Spike. Spike's dreams of flying were rudely interrupted by a feeling of minor heartburn and a familiar rumble in his gut. Even being roused out of a deep sleep, he knew what to expect and, out of habit, he angled his head upwards just as a massive flame-shrouded belch ripped its way out of his mouth. Smacking his lips to clear the aftertaste, Spike rolled over and hicked his blanket up around his shoulders. "Ladder, Twilight," he mumbled as he tried to drift off again. A few seconds passed, and he became vaguely aware that Twilight hadn't responded. He lifted a groggy head and then spent the next few seconds staring around in blank confusion. He wasn't in his basket at the foot of Twilight's bed. He wasn't even on the main floor. He was, for some unknown reason, laying cocooned in some blankets in the basement. The previous night came back to him in a sudden rush. He had been watching movies on his tablet without Twilight's supervision, and he had really enjoyed himself, though it had taken him a while to get used to the whole dragons as pets thing. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to figure out a way to sneak back up into the kitchen and make popcorn without waking up Twilight in the process. "Master fell asleep," Spike mumbled. The movies had been great, with the second being even better than the first, and the third at least starting out amazing. His memory of the third movie washed out after a little while, and he realized he must have fallen asleep shortly after the movie had started. Spike yawned hugely and rubbed a hand across his eyes to clear the sleep crust away as he looked around for his tablet. He finally spotted it lying on the floor next to where he'd spent the night curled up. He picked it up with a grin, deciding that there was no time like the present to finish watching that movie, before Twilight found him and started loading up his day with chores. The screen was dark, so he hit the button on top like Twilight had told him to do. Nothing happened. Spike blinked and pushed the button again, this time a little harder. Nothing continued to happen, much to Spike's growing alarm. He pushed it again and again, and, after not getting any response from the tablet, raised it above his head and shook it gently. It didn't do any good. Tears welled up in Spike's eyes. "Oh no, I broke it!" He tossed aside his blankets and, chubby legs pumping, raced up the stairs while sobs hitched at his lungs. He flung the basement door open and took a deep breath. "Twilight!" came the sobbing wail as he ran through the library. "Spike?" Spike looked around to see Twilight looking slightly frazzled herself as she stood by the front door with her saddlebags on. "Spike, where have you—" Twilight shook her head and took a few steps towards him. "Never mind, what's wrong?" "I broke it!" Spike cried, holding out his precious tablet. Twilight blinked at it as she picked the tablet up with her magic, frowning for a moment before a look of realization came into her eyes. "Spike, did you spend the whole night playing with your tablet?" If he'd been less upset, Spike would have noticed the half-dangerous, half-amused tone of voice that Twilight was directing towards him. As it was, he was too wound up in his personal tragedy to notice. "Yeah, and then I fell asleep, and when I woke up it wouldn't turn back on." All the crying had made Spike's nose runny, so he rubbed his forearm across his snout and snuffled, not noticing Twilight's shudder as he did so. Then he flung himself forward and hugged her around one foreleg. "I broke it!" Spike cried miserably. "It's not broken, Spike," Twilight said as she tried to tuck her leg out from his grasp. "It just needs more power. The battery ran out." Spike looked up at her, the fires of hope swelling in him. "Really?" "Yes, really," Twilight said, finally able to extract her leg from his embrace. She grimaced at a shiny spot on her fur before continuing. "You just need to plug it in for a while and it should be fine." Relief washed over him, drowning out every other emotion and bringing out a huge smile on his face. "That's great," he said, directing his grin at Twilight. The look she directed back down at him made his smile falter as the relief started to drain away. It was a perfectly straight mouth, narrow eyes and a raised eyebrow that Twilight used whenever she wanted to let him know that he'd gone and messed something up. "Oh, I suppose I'm in trouble?" he asked weakly. Twilight considered this for a moment. "Yes and no." "Huh?" Spike replied, completely at a loss. Fortunately, Twilight was more than willing to fill him in. "No, you're not in trouble for sneaking off and watching movies all night instead of sleeping. I think the worry you went through when you thought you'd broken your tablet is enough punishment for that." Twilight smiled gently down at him and rubbed his head with a hoof. Spike breathed a sigh of relief. "Oh, good, because I thought—" "However," Twilight continued, "for disappearing without telling me where you were and making me worry all morning, I think it's only fair that you get some punishment for that." She frowned down at him, anguish plain on her features. "I was really worried, Spike. I was about to go out and try to find you." "Oh." Spike looked down at the floor and saw that he was tracing a random doodle on the floor with his toes. "I didn't think of that. I'm sorry." Twilight drew him into a hug. "Apology accepted, and no using your tablet for 3 days. "What?" Spike tried to squirm his way out of Twilight's embrace. "Aw, come on, Twilight." "Nope, sorry," Twilight said, hugging him tighter. "Though with good behavior, I might trim the sentence down to 2 days. "Fine," Spike grumbled. "Oh, I forgot, you got a letter. That's what woke me up." "Well, you'd better go get it then, shouldn't you?" Twilight's voice was teasing as she released him and ruffled his spines with a hoof once again. "You got it!" It took only a minute for Spike to get back down to the basement, pack up the blankets in storage once again, and get back upstairs with the scroll. Twilight took it in her magic and unrolled it, reading it quietly for a minute or so. "Huh," she said eventually. "What's up?" "Princess Celestia is asking if I can come to Canterlot today. Apparently she has something she wants to discuss with me. Oh, does she say why? It looks like a few things, really, Twilight said, rolling up the scroll and set it on a nearby shelf. One is, it looks like she's going to announce a change to the schedule for the Gateway to Earth. You think she's going to make it happen more often? Probably, judging by the second thing she wanted to talk to me about. Spike glanced at the scroll before looking back at Twilight. She seemed both excited and nervous about something. There was probably a word for that, but he was at a loss to think of it. What's that? He asked. Well, apparently there's some sort of cultural exchange program about to start up. Human students are going to come to Equestria for school and ponies are going to Earth for the same reason. Twilight grinned awkwardly and shrugged. The mayor that was organizing things can't see it through for some reason, so she's asking if I could help organize the reception and orientation of the students heading to Earth, as well as the humans coming to Equestria. Spike considered that for a moment. Wouldn't Aaron be useful for that? Good point, Twilight said with a nod and a frown. I'll ask the princess if I can invite her. Is that all? No, Twilight said, still frowning. There was something else that she didn't want to put down in a scroll that she said she wanted to tell me personally. Spike snorted. I'm surprised you're not out of the door already. Don't be silly, Spike. Twilight glanced at the clock on a nearby shelf. The next express train to Canterlot doesn't arrive for another 40 minutes. Spike gaped at her. You seriously have the train timetables memorized? Yeah. Twilight raised an eyebrow. It's not like it's all of them, just the ones to and from Canterlot. He blinked at her a few times before shrugging. I honestly have nothing to say to that. Twilight rolled her eyes. Seriously, though, would you mind running along and letting the girls know that I may be gone for a couple of days? She grimaced down at the shiny spot on her leg. I need to shower real quickly before I head out, so I won't have time to do it myself. You got it, Twilight. Spike fired off a salute and charged towards the door. Operation Be on Best Behavior in order to get the tablet back faster was off to a running start. Aaron. There was only one store in town that actually sold beds, and that was Hattrack's Furniture Warehouse. With their small selection, it hadn't taken Aaron long to decide on which to buy. It was roughly the same size as a full-sized human bed, though slightly shorter. She also purchased a few small bookshelves, a nightstand, and several other bits and pieces that Aaron hadn't realized she needed, such as a thick, very welcome mat for visitors to clean their hoofs on before walking into her house. Some accent art had been added to the purchase as well. Amongst the many, many landscape paintings available, there had been two pieces that had taken Aaron's interest. One was a watercolor of Cloudsdale, looking dreamlike and mystical. The other had been a strangely compelling picture of a frozen lake in wintertime, with dread reeds poking up above the snow cover. The sales pony that had helped her, a stallion by the name of Tallymark, had seemed surprised at her interest in those two paintings, particularly the frozen lake. Aaron had gotten the impression that the lake painting had been in stock for a while, without any pony showing much interest in it. For some reason that made her all the more determined to buy it. With her bid bag significantly lighter and the delivery arranged for the next day, Aaron left Hattrack's store with a satisfied smile on her face. Being able to spend so much money so freely was still a new experience for her, and there was something deeply satisfying about spending so much and knowing that she still had plenty left. Aaron was still composing a grocery list in her mind when someone came up behind her and tugged on her tail. Her ears flattened instinctively as she rounded on whoever it was that would be rude enough to do that. Her mouth was already open, ready for the scathing reproach that had jumped immediately to mind. When she realized that it was a breathless Spike, her annoyance melted away. The poor little guy looked like he'd been running himself into the ground. "Spike, is everything okay?" The little dragon nodded and held up a claw to indicate the need for a moment to catch his breath as he gasped for air. "Hey, Aaron," he said once he'd recovered enough. "Twilight wanted me to let every pony know that she'd be going to Canterlot for a couple of days at least. The princess wants her for something." Aaron blinked. "Oh, okay, thanks. How's it going?" "I told Rarity and Pinkie Pie first thing, and lucky for me, Applejack had her stall set up in the market. I still have to tell Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy, though." A panicked look came over Spike's face as he looked at the big clock tower in the middle of town. Oh no, the train will be here in another 10 minutes. I have to get back before then. Aaron smiled down at him and ruffled the spines on his head. If you wanted me to, I'd be happy to tell Rainbow and Fluttershy. The look of relief that washed over the dragon's face made Aaron giggle a little. You'd do that? Sure. It's not like I'm going to be late for work or anything. Aaron shrugged. Besides, there's no way you'd make it to Fluttershy's and back in 10 minutes. I was going to go to Rainbow Dash's house next and ask her to fly me out there and back, Spike said. But now I don't have to worry about that. Thanks, Aaron. You bet, Spike. Always glad to help. Spike started running off before stopping a short distance away. Oh, I almost forgot. One of the reasons Princess Celestia wanted Twilight to come out was because of some sort of exchange program. Aaron raised an eyebrow. Exchange program? Yeah, I guess some colts and fillies are going to Earth and some human kids are coming to Equestria for school. Anyway, Twilight was going to ask if it was okay with the princess if she asked you to come out. Wow, a student exchange program? Neat! Aaron grinned. I'd be happy to help out if Princess Celestia wants me to. Thanks, I'll let Twilight know. Spike started walking quickly away, waving over his shoulder. Thanks, Aaron. Oh, and thanks for the cool tablet thing, too. You got it, Spike, Aaron called back, waving a hoof. Spike disappeared around a corner at a quick jog. Aaron chuckled and shook her head before starting her walk once again. It looked like grocery shopping would have to wait a bit, she decided as she made her way once again towards Rainbow Dash's cloud house. Twilight. Twilight Sparklight showered as fast as was equally possible in order to save precious minutes before her trip to Canterlot. She'd even left her mane damp rather than trying to dry it since, even with a drying spell, doing so would still add minutes of time to getting ready. She had packed her saddlebags with crisp efficiency, reusing an old, tried-and-true checklist to make sure that she had everything she could possibly need. Specifically, she had used the pre-mission, non-test checklist, which was heavy on preparatory items like scrolls, ink and quills, but light on flashcards and other study aids. She wasn't going to Canterlot to take a test after all, but she had to be ready for whatever it was that Celestia wanted her to do. And now she found herself ready but unable to go, pacing back and forth in the large central room of the main floor of the library as her tension mounted higher and higher. Every time she changed directions, she would steal a glance at the wall clock, mutter darkly, and then start pacing again. Her options were limited to only 3, from what she could see. 1. She could keep waiting for Spike, who may or may not show up in time for them to get to the train. 2. She could go out and find him, which ran a high risk of them missing each other and thus the train, which was clearly unacceptable. The third option, which she was most inclined to choose at the moment, was to head to the train station immediately by leaving a note for Spike to follow as soon as he got home. Upon reflection, option 3 had some obvious problems. Mainly in that Spike may not see the note or might not arrive at the station on time if he did. Which would mean that Twilight would still miss the train regardless. The more she considered it, the less viable it seemed. The only time savings would be in the purchasing of the tickets. While she was considering her options, the clock ticked and sliced off another minute of her day. The low, frustrated growl that started building in her throat cut off as the library door opened and Spike stumbled in. The little dragon stopped in the doorway, bending over with his hands on his knees as he wheezed and tried to catch his breath. Twilight's annoyance was immediately swamped by a flood of sympathy. The little guy had obviously been running himself ragged in order to do what she asked. As she watched her number 1 assistant and best friend struggle for air, guilt also started to make itself known, welling up in her chest and crowding out the last of her frustration. She had given him an impossible task, she realized. Of course he'd have run himself ragged trying to achieve it. Still, there was a schedule to keep and the train would be arriving from Canterlot very soon. Twilight cleared her throat. Are you okay, Spike? Yeah, just out of breath. He straightened with a grunt. Told every pony but Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy. Aaron said she'd take care of it for me. You did a great job, Spike, Twilight said, making sure she had a smile on her face. Spike beamed back at her as her horn lit up. I'll carry you to the station, all right? Spike nodded and Twilight lifted him onto her back. There was only one stop to make on the way to the station. About a block away from the cottage was a small cottage with a tiny but well-kept garden. Twilight made her way through the gate and knocked on the white-painted door. It was hard to keep her hoof from tapping as she waited on the front step for the pony inside to answer. In fact, she just raised her hoof to knock again when an elderly mare opened the door, blinking in the sunlight and scowling at her.
"Let me guess,"
the mare said without preamble.
"Princess got you running to Canterlot again?"
"Hi, Miss Staggs," Twilight said. "Yes, I'm afraid so. Could you watch the library again while I'm gone?"
Mrs. Staggs sighed and patted her iron-gray mane, which was already arranged in its standard bun.
"How long this time?"
"Hard to say. A few days at least. I'll send a letter as soon as I know for sure."
The old mare humphed at her and scowled.
"You know, I thought when I retired as a town librarian that would mean I'd actually get to stay away from the library from time to time."
Twilight's grin was both apologetic and a little impatient. The train would be coming soon after all.
"I'm really sorry, Mrs. Staggs. When I get back, I can look into training some pony else to take over as backup if you like."
Worry flashed across the old mare's eyes, and her frown slackened just a little.
No need,
she said quickly, waving a hoof.
"Youngsters these days have no appreciation for books anyway."
She affected the long-suffering sigh that Twilight was almost positive was at least partially an act.
"I'll do it. You'd best be going. You look fit to burst with the way your hoofs are dancing."
Twilight's awkward grin morphed into a pleasant smile.
"Thank you, Miss Staggs. I'll send a letter as soon as I know more."
"Don't mention it, dear,"
Mrs. Staggs replied.
"Bye,"
Twilight said as her horn started glowing. A flash of magic later, and she had teleported half a block closer to the train station.
"Ugh, warn a guy when you do that, okay?"
Spike complained from his perch on her back. With all the practicing she'd gotten in recently, it was easy for Twilight to forget how disorienting a teleport could be when you weren't used to them, especially when some pony else was the one controlling the teleport.
"Sorry, Spike, I'm just eager to get to the train is all."
"It's not even going to be there for what? 4 minutes? Then they have to board every pony, which takes,
about 20 minutes for the arrivals to disembark and for the departing ponies to get on board. Another 10 minutes to pick up any stragglers, and then they're leaving."
"So we have over 30 minutes before the train leaves. Why so panicky?"
Twilight rolled her eyes as she trotted along. Spike should know better than that.
"Because anything could go wrong, Spike. Honestly, if we could have been waiting an hour earlier, I would have been much happier. Besides, what if they leave early? Then they'd got a strongly worded letter from a certain purple unicorn regarding the importance of keeping to a schedule?"
Spike ventured. Twilight looked back at him and arched an eyebrow.
"Schedules are important, Spike. Besides, my coat is lavender."
Looks purple to me,"
Spike said before yawning.
"I'm gonna close my eyes for a minute. Wake me when we get on the train, okay?"
Twilight chuckled.
"Sure, Spike."
The rest of the trip was uneventful, for which Twilight was grateful. Spike had long since adapted to sleeping through nearly anything while on her back, but if he was startled awake, he had an unfortunate habit of deploying his claws and grabbing onto her coat. The ticket booth had a small line, which was another reason why Twilight had wanted to get here early. She didn't mind waiting ordinarily, but she absolutely despised waiting in a line. With a constant shuffling forward, it was impossible to do something even as simple as read a book while waiting for her turn to buy a ticket. Fortunately, the line moved quickly. Twilight had just bought her ticket and made her way onto the platform when the train slowed to a stop with a screech of metal on metal. Naturally, this woke Spike with a start, and Twilight grimaced and tensed until the baby dragon relaxed enough to pull his needle-sharp claws out of her skin and fall back asleep. As the porters began unloading passengers and their baggage, Twilight's eyes was drawn to a large peacock feather bobbing over the crowd. Her eyes followed the feather down, which showed that it was attached to a large, stylish hat. Under the hat was a very familiar face, which was also scanning the crowd. Rarity met Twilight's eyes, and both ponies broke into large smiles and began trotting towards each other, Rarity leaving her larger pile of luggage behind her to be dealt with by several porters.
"Rarity, what are you doing here?"
The other unicorn snickered at that.
"It's nice to see you too, Twilight."
Twilight blushed at that.
"Well, yeah, sorry. Nice to see you, Rarity. Are you heading to Canterlot too?" "Yes, it's quite a coincidence, isn't it?"
Rarity tossed her head, and her elegantly styled mane bounced and swayed along with the peacock feather in her hat. Twilight had wondered on more than one occasion what it took for her friend to manage those curls every morning. Rarity, while keen on giving grooming and fashion advice, was strangely reluctant to go into the details of her own beauty routine.
"I've been invited by no less than Fancy Pants himself to consult on a new line of fashion accessoires for ponies heading to Earth."
Rarity's beaming smile lit up her face as she began hopping in place, the peacock feather bouncing wildly as she did so.
"Oh, it's just so exciting!"
Twilight blinked, confused. While Rarity consulting on anything fashion-related didn't seem unusual, the fact that she was being asked for her input on something so specific was a little confusing. Twilight decided to try for some clarification.
"Fashion accessoires for Earth?"
"Yes, to replace the standard togs that every pony wears now. They're trying to store magic in everything from earrings to hair clips, tail bows and bracelets. Anything more fashionable and less obtrusive than these togs which, while lovely, are a bit unwieldy."
"Oh, I see. And Fancy Pants asked for you specifically?"
Rarity positively glowed as she nodded.
"Oh, yes. It's wonderful having friends in high places, isn't it?"
Her smile faded slightly.
"Oh, but listen to me, going on all this time about me without even asking about you. I understand that the princess wanted you in Canterlot for a few days?"
"Yes, that's right," Twilight replied with a nod.
"Didn't Spike mention why?"
"I'm afraid not," Rarity said with a shake of her head. "The poor dear burst into my boutique while I was in the middle of packing, blurting out his message, and was gone before I could even ask him how his day was." Twilight flinched at that, looking guiltily over her shoulder at her assistant, who was still asleep on her back and smiling at whatever dream he was having. The fact that Spike didn't even stay to exchange pleasantries with Rarity, of all ponies, suggested that he'd been in something of a panic trying to follow her instructions.
"Sorry, little guy,"
she murmured to the sleeping dragon. Even though she'd been summoned by Princess Celestia, Twilight determined right then and there that their first stop in Canterlot would be Donut Joe's donut shop. Spike deserved a treat for all he'd had to put up with today. To go, of course. He could eat on the way to the palace, provided he was careful not to get any crumbs on her coat. The two of them chatted for a while longer, up until they started boarding the train. Spike woke up on his own at that point, stared at Rarity for a few seconds, then started desperately running his hands over his head to make sure his spines were straight. Twilight giggled, but Rarity politely pretended not to notice. As the three of them sat together, talking and just enjoying each other's company, Twilight felt some of the tension she'd been carrying all morning begin to fade. From Spike's disappearance to the princess's letter, she'd been feeling nothing but frazzled and on edge. But now, with the promise of a swift trip to Canterlot in the company of two good friends, she could finally begin to relax. Erin got back to her house a little after 5 in the afternoon. Her second round of grocery buying had netted her such staples as sliced bread, jelly, peanut butter, and assorted fruits. In addition, she'd bought a few boxes of dry pasta and some sauces in jars. Hopefully, boiling some water in a pot wouldn't prove too much of a strain on her culinary skills. She made her way to the bathroom once again in order to touch up her coat, mane and wings, since she didn't want to make a bad first impression on her neighbor. Well, third impression if she was getting technical, but this would be her first time in Ditsy Doo's home and she wanted to be sure she was at her best. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Erin unplugged her tablet and broke out her hoof strap and stylus in order to play a few time-wasting games, mostly involving blowing up floating piles of fruit with slingshot-mounted bombs. She'd never really stopped to consider the logic of that, but it was a fun game. Her tablet's timer went off 5 minutes before she was due at Ditsy Doo's house for dinner. She packed the tablet away, napped the box of pastries off of the counter and set it on her back before walking out of the front door. From the outside, Ditsy's house looked much like hers, a small thatch-roofed house with a second floor that was about half the size of the first. The primary difference was that the siding was painted a light pink with a bright yellow trim. Erin knocked gently on the door and then spent a busy few seconds running her hoofs over Ditsy's welcome mat, trying to clear any dirt or debris off before her hosts opened the door. She was still at it when the door was flung open.
"Hello,"
Ditsy said cheerfully.
"Hi,"
Erin said as she looked up. Then she froze. One of Ditsy's eyes was looking right at her, but the other one was looking up and to the left. After a moment of staring, Aaron forced a smile, desperately hoping that Ditsy hadn't noticed. It wasn't meant to be. The Pegasus chuckled and pointed the hoof at her right eye.
Oh, this? Sorry, that happens sometimes when I'm tired or distracted. I should have warned you. Some ponies find it a little unnerving. Hold on, I can fix it.
Ditsy frowned and blinked a few times in rapid succession. All the while Aaron was babbling,
Oh no, it doesn't bother me. Ah, there we go,
Ditsy said, smiling. She looked at Aaron, now with both eyes facing in the right direction.
How's that? Much better?
Aaron's own eyes widened then.
Not that it was bad before, I mean...
Ditsy's joyful laugh cut her off.
Don't worry about it. I've had this condition my whole life. It doesn't bother me anymore as long as ponies don't tease me about it. Come on in.
Ditsy stepped inside and Aaron began walking through the door.
Who would tease you about that?
She asked, feeling a little disturbed. Ponies always seemed to be so nice. Mean-spirited teasing seemed wrong and out of character. With a shrug, Ditsy just said,
Foals can be cruel sometimes. Oh, speaking of foals, Dinky is out playing with some friends. She should be home soon.
She pointed the hoof at the box on Aaron's back.
Are those the pastries? I'll grab them if that's okay.
Aaron nodded, and Ditsy took the box in her teeth before planting it on her own back. Then she trotted off towards the kitchen, which Aaron noticed was in the same location as her own.
Make yourself at home. I'm just going to pull this casserole out of the oven and get the salad ready. Okay,
Aaron called before looking around. Now that she'd gotten a closer look, it was obvious that Ditsy's house was built with the same floor plan as Aaron's, which likely meant a bathroom, largish bedroom, and a living room on the first floor and a smaller bedroom upstairs with its own half-bathroom. That was where the similarities ended. Aaron's own home was well maintained but sparse in its decorating and furnishing, largely due to her having just moved in. Ditsy's home was well worn and obviously lived in. The living area was arranged so that several ponies could all relax and talk together, dominated by a large, somewhat faded and threadbare red couch facing two smaller, matching chairs with a coffee table in the middle. One smaller, non-matching chair was obviously for Ditsy's daughter Dinky, considering that the small end table next to it was loaded with coloring books. Next to the books was a green-painted tin can that held a variety of crayons and colored pencils. Aaron wandered through the living room, noticing the rugs that covered most of the sitting area. It was a sky blue with patterns of fluffy white clouds. It would have been lovely if it weren't for the occasional colorful stain, ranging from deep reds to purples to, for some reason, bright green. Aaron assumed the redder stains were probably from juice spillouts, but for the life of her she couldn't figure out the bright green one. The fireplace was almost identical to Aaron's except for the childlike scrawlings and stick figure ponies on some of the lower bricks. On the mantelpiece were framed photos mostly showing a lavender unicorn filly with a blonde mane mugging at the camera. Aaron guessed that this must be Dinky and also noticed that the filly had a fondness of making silly faces. Out of all the pictures the filly featured in, only 3 had her smiling normally. 2 of those pictures also had a smiling Ditsy in them, the mother and daughter posing for the camera with Ditsy holding her daughter to her side with a wing. The third featured both Ditsy and Dinky as well as a third, older mare, which Aaron guessed to be Ditsy's mother, judging by the family resemblance. There were toys on the floor, Aaron noticed, though they were all tucked behind the furniture. Pony ragdolls, balls, blocks, and even some jacks, which Aaron made sure to steer clear of. She'd stepped on jacks with bare feet before, and she had no intention of repeating the experience with hooves. There were a lot of blocks, Aaron noticed. In the back corner of the room was a carefully created little town made of wooden blocks in various shapes and sizes, with small wooden pony figures standing in the streets. It was rough, and none of the buildings had roofs. Right then, Aaron decided to buy a bucket of Legos for the filly to see if that was something she'd like. It would be something else for Ditsy to avoid stepping on, but if the filly liked building things that much, then Aaron was sure she'd appreciate the gift. Just then the front door opened. Aaron looked up just in time to see the little filly in question walking through the front door. Her heart caught in her throat as she saw who was walking in behind her.
Mom!
Dinky called.
I'm in the kitchen,
came the reply.
Can I have a friend over for dinner too? We already checked with her mom and it's okay. Sure, fine by me as long as you two behave yourselves,
Ditsy called back.
You want to help me set up the table? Your friend can wait in the living room with Erin.
Sure.
Ditsy trotted off towards the kitchen. Her guest, a unicorn filly with a golden coat and dark brown mane, looked around uncertainly for a moment before walking into the living room. Erin backed away, trying to get some moisture back into her teeth as her heart began pounding. The movement brought the filly's light green eyes onto her, which widened in shock.
Sunflower?
The filly said, the shock plainly evident in her voice. Erin's mouth hung open for a few seconds before an involuntary smile started growing.
Hi, Marigold,
she said weakly.